Washington State has a lot of nuclear chemistry history involved in it. So let's talk about the Hanford site. The Manhattan Project was a top secret government project. Germany and Japan were trying to develop the first atomic bomb, but so was the United States. And the Hanford site in eastern Washington played a very important role. So let's step back. Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt, and he was urging him to get the United States involved and get their hands on some uranium before other countries did. Roosevelt listened and responded with putting together a team of the most talented and renowned scientists in the world to collaborate on this very serious task, to build the first atomic bomb. So for the Hanford site's involvement, the scientists were interested in making enriched uranium or plutonium, and the Hanford site was used to make the plutonium. The other reactor to make the enriched uranium was built in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You might wonder, why did they choose Washington State? Well, they needed a large site that could be kept top secret, where the climate was mild so that they could have a lot of days where they could do outdoor construction. They also needed something to cool the very, very hot reactor, so this was close to the Columbia River. People who lived on the site that the government was planning to take over were mostly farmers. They were actually forced to leave their homes for a very small amount of money for no explanation, and they only had 30 days to move out. Here are some actual pipes that are bringing in water from the Columbia River to cool the reactor. So out went the farmers, and soon the Hanford site was booming with over 51,000 construction workers and their families. Nobody even knew what was going on. They had no idea that they were building a nuclear reactor that would ultimately fuel the world's first atomic bomb. Actually, less than 1% of the workers knew the details of the project. Construction started in October of 1943, and the B reactor was finished very shortly, less than a year later in 1944. It was basically 28 by 36 feet, 1,200 ton pile of graphite blocks, and it was penetrated by 2004 aluminum tubes. This was the chain reactor that we're talking about. More than 300 tons of uranium slugs, the size of rolls of quarters and sealed in aluminum cans, went into the tubes. The Columbia River was supplying 70,000 gallons of cool water per minute through the B reactor. They also built other reactors 6 miles apart, and 6 more reactors were built after the war. Here's a picture of what the chain reactor looks like from the side. So the rods went straight into these holes here. And here's a picture of me at that same reactor. So while this was happening, Enrico Fermi was working with his team to create the first self-sustaining chain reaction. And of course there was the large team of scientists working in Los Alamos in New Mexico to develop the atomic bomb. And in the meantime, at the B reactor at the Hanford site, they were making plutonium for the Trinity device. This was the atomic bomb trial run in New Mexico. They were also making plutonium for the second atomic bomb, which ended up being dropped on Nagasaki, and they called it Little Boy. Fat Man was the first atomic bomb dropped in a war. That was made from the enriched uranium that was produced in Tennessee. They had to use code words because everything was top secret. So plutonium was called the product, uranium was base metal, Fermi himself was Mr. Farmer. An interesting significant figure application, the fuel rods could vary only in diameter by 0.003 of an inch. Side note too, the B reactor also made tritium for the first hydrogen bomb, the first fusion bomb. So these are some shots that I took while I was touring the B reactor. I felt like a mad scientist sitting at the controls desk. There were a lot of buttons my husband wanted to push. Everything looked really complicated. Hanford today looks a little bit different. All the buildings around the reactors have been torn down. A lot of people had to fight to keep the B reactor there. Of course, the site is controversial because of moral reasons. I mean, this is where they made the fuel for the atomic bombs that killed many, many, many innocent people. But the engineering was so complex, and it was built in such a small amount of time, that it's been recognized as a National Historic Landmark. A not so fun fact, the Hanford site is on the most polluted site in North America. It's safe to visit because the radiation isn't airborne, but there are 440 billion gallons of contaminated liquid. These were just dumped into the soil. So they, at the time, this wasn't their priority to think about how they were going to deal with the waste. Also, they had these big tanks, 177 underground tanks, and a lot of these are leaking. Anyone can tour the Hanford site. Registration usually opens in March, and the slots for all the June through August tours fill up in seconds. So you might get lucky if you check back and there's a cancellation. But I highly recommend the tour. It's 4 hours long, and half an hour of that is just getting on the bus to get from Richland to the Hanford site. One of my bucket list items, changing the pace a little bit here, was to visit the Trinity site near Albuquerque, New Mexico, and to also visit the National Nuclear Science Museum, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So, April of 2014, I got to check those bucket list items off. Here's a picture of me waiting at the Trinity site 2 hours south of Albuquerque. At 6 a.m. we were door busting. We were ready to go, and there were still quite a few cars in front of us. So here's Albuquerque, and here's approximately where the Trinity site is. So it's really in the middle of nowhere. Here's a picture of me next to one of the radioactive signs outside. And there was actually another Newport student there while I was there. There was some trinitite on the ground. This is some leftover sand that was basically fused into glass from the high heats that were created from the Trinity test. This is all that remains of the tower that they dropped the atomic bomb from. It's just a stub. This is the actual spot where the first atomic bomb landed. So that's called Ground Zero, and they built a memorial statue there. Since we're only a few hours away, we also checked out Roswell, New Mexico, the famous site where aliens apparently crash landed their UFO. So they have a little museum there. Then we went to the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History. They had a B-29 bomber plane there, which is the same as the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. Here's a replica of the atomic bomb they used for the Trinity test, and a replica of Little Boy. While we were in Albuquerque, we also stopped at some of the Breaking Bad sites. So this is Walter White's house. I highly recommend a trip to Albuquerque. If you've never been there, there's a lot of history to see there.